Well, hi everyone. An interesting couple of minutes before the event. Well, I guess when there's always pushback, we know that we're doing something right. So thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for waiting. My name is Elom, and I will be your MC for today. I'm joining you all from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, historic Lenape land. And for me, it's important to mention as we honor the legacy of the real owners of the land we're on. So once again, thank you so much for joining. Thank you so much for your patience. And welcome to the latest Kumi Now online gathering. Today we're discussing Israel's nation state law and the many related laws that create a discriminatory framework in Israel. Before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that this session is being broadcast live on Facebook. So if you do not wish to appear, please feel free to turn off your video feed. And also, we would love if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared in the chat so that others may join. It's always wonderful to share information, to tell people about the great work and the great discussions that are going on in here. Also, we're inviting people from the audience to tell us how they are applying Kumi Now back in your community or how you're advocating for Palestine. So if you have an idea, if you have a project, if you have something interesting that you would like to share in a future meeting, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. And that will be KUMI@KUMINOW.com.
And starting it now.
Awesome. And now it's time for our weekly activism survey. So Mark, if you could launch the poll, that would be great. So we have a poll with a few questions, and if you could answer those questions, that would be great. So we'll take about a minute or so to answer those questions. Is the poll live? Okay, we'll take about 30 more seconds to round up with our poll, and we would share the answers of that. All right, so the first question was basically what we're doing personally. And so I'm sure there'll be varying answers for that. The answer to question 2 is, interestingly, the nation state law was passed in 2018. So that's something that we should take note of. And then finally, the answer to question 3, which is what prominent minority group besides Palestinian and Israelis strongly oppose the nation state's law? And the answer is Druze. So hope we got those answers. And I see in the chat that there's a lot of Olas coming in. So, well, maybe they're trying to be friendly this time. So well, fingers crossed on that. Well, anyway, today we're switching things up a little bit, and we will hear from our guest first. Then Omar will come in after the end with his updates on the ground. I don't want to say too much about Jonathan. I'll let him introduce himself, but I would just like to say that I encountered his work when I came to Palestine in 2019 with a group, and I was deeply, deeply moved by it. So I love how things have come full circle, and I'm listening, and we're all listening to Jonathan today. I can assure you that this would be a very interesting, informative, and moving discussion. So without much ado, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Elom. Very kind of you to introduce me, and I'm happy to see you again. You're probably one of the last people I saw before the pandemic struck and we stopped having visitors to Nazareth. Hopefully we'll see people coming back again soon. And I'm also happy to see some familiar faces, and I'm very happy to be invited by Sabeel to talk to you. So let me just say one or two things about myself. My background is that I'm a British journalist. I worked at the Guardian newspaper and its sister publication, The Observer, for many years before coming out to Nazareth, to live in Nazareth in the year 2001. I'm just coming up to my 20th anniversary here. I've been a freelance journalist all that time. I've written for many different publications, my old newspaper, The Guardian. I also write today for Middle East Eye, predominantly. Some other publications that I've written for in the past include The National, based in Abu Dhabi, and Al Jazeera in Qatar. And I found that over the years, the more I've got to understand what's going on here, the harder it has become to write for Western media that maybe don't want too deep an analysis of what's going on here. The coverage, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is fairly superficial at some level. I think it's significant today. I didn't plan it this way. I'm sure Sabeel didn't plan it this way, but the day that I talk to you is also the day that Human Rights Watch has just issued its report saying that Israel is an apartheid state and calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate Israeli officials for committing crimes of apartheid and persecution. In other words, breaking international law. Human Rights Watch isn't, of course, the first group to do this, but I think it's significant because we saw B'Tselem issue a report in January making the same points. We've now seen in the last few months both the most important human rights group in Israel and now possibly the most important human rights group in the West, along with maybe Amnesty International, saying that Israel is an apartheid state. And not only is it talking about apartheid, both organizations are no longer talking about apartheid in restricting it to the occupied territories. They are talking about Israel overseeing an apartheid regime, both in the occupied territories and inside Israel. That's something that people like me have been saying for many, many years, but it's good to hear that some of the leading human rights groups are now making exactly the same point as we have been making. And it will hopefully increase the pressure on the International Criminal Court to take action. There's a battle going on behind the scenes over what to do about prosecuting Israeli officials. There's obviously a huge international pressure being lobbied by America and Europe to avoid prosecuting Israeli officials, investigating them and prosecuting them. We need leverage on the other side, and groups like B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch specifying that in their expert knowledge of international law, Israel is committing the crime of apartheid, I think is very significant and important. And we should be echoing what they're saying very loudly, amplifying what they're saying very loudly. Now, I've been asked to talk about the nation state law, and what I want to do is try and explain, you just answered a survey in which you were asked which year was the nation state law passed, 2018. But I think what I want to tell you today, the take home away from this, I suppose, is that it may have been passed the law in 2018, but most of what it's trying to achieve has been going on right from the birth of Israel. There's really not that much new about the nation state law. What Israel has been doing is creating the nation state law that we have today, etching it onto the ground for more than 7 decades. And I want to talk briefly about how it's been doing that. The purpose of the nation state law is really to create a very clear distinction between the right of Jewish or Jews around the world to claim citizenship in the, let's call it the Holy Land, in historic Palestine, or however you want to describe it, as a superior right over the right of Palestinians, whether they're inside Israel as citizens or in the occupied territories as non-citizens, as subjects of an occupation, to give them inferior rights, to create these two classes of rights. And there are more gradations within this, of course. Obviously, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you have more rights than a Palestinian subject of the occupation. But the primary issue here, which both B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch have been talking about, is that the goal here is one of creating a space that privileges Jews and discriminates against Palestinians, excludes them from consideration in the centers of power, and gives them a degraded status for the fact that they are Palestinians. So I want to talk a little bit. It's fairly clear what's going on in the occupied territories. You're doing a series of these kinds of seminars. I'm sure you're very clear already of the sort of discrimination that's going on in the occupied territories. So I want to focus a little bit more about what's going on inside Israel for Palestinian citizens, the 1.8 million Palestinian citizens inside Israel, fifth of Israel's population. How are they being discriminated against? Israel is veiling this, of course. It's very important that it's not too clear what's going on here. And so we need to do a bit of work to understand the legal frameworks that Israel has created to not only create this distinction between rights for Jews and rights for non-Jews, but also how it veils it. Both of these things are going on at the same time. So let me just briefly talk about citizenship in Israel, which is quite complicated, more complicated than it is in the US or Europe. Israel has created two citizenship laws. One is fairly famous, the Law of Return of 1950, which confers on Jews their right to come to Israel and enter the citizenship process, which is almost automatic if you're a Jew. And then a separate law that applies to Palestinians, the small number of Palestinians who have citizenship, access to citizenship under the Citizenship Law of 1952. So you've got the Law of Return for Jews, the Citizenship Law for non-Jews, primarily for Palestinians. Now, Americans should know from their history, the civil rights history, that any kind of separation like this, legal separation, creates inherent inequality. That's actually quoting from a US Supreme Court ruling in 1954. When you separate rights, you are creating a situation of systematic inherent inequality. That's the purpose of it. And that's exactly what Israel is doing here. I would suggest you see these two laws, the law that applies to Jews, the Law of Return, and the law that applies to Palestinians, the Citizenship Law, as effectively two doors into Israel. One door is wide open for any Jew in the world to get on a plane, paid for by Israeli taxpayers, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, and come and claim their right to citizenship. Whereas the citizenship law excludes all, in fact, we shouldn't really call it a citizenship law. Primarily, it's an anti-citizenship law. The purpose of it is to stop the vast majority of Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 during the Nakba from ever being allowed to return home. Just a small number who managed to cling onto the land in 1948 get their right to citizenship through this law. So it's primarily an anti-citizenship law. Now, why has Israel created this separate citizenship structure? A lot of this is to do with enforcing, institutionalizing a separation of rights. We'll get to that point in a moment. But just to point out that today, that door, the citizenship law, the door for non-Jews to get into Israel is almost entirely shut. Israel has closed off access to Palestinians to gain citizenship. And in fact, the only way that a non-Jew can get citizenship in Israel today is through marriage. And the only reason Israel allows that is because a tiny number of people qualify. According to the Israeli media, about 50 non-Jews are able to naturalize to gain citizenship through marriage. It doesn't matter whether they marry an Israeli Jew or a Palestinian, but they can enter this naturalization process, and it's supposed to take 5 years. I should point out, it never does. It always takes much longer. In my own case, because after I married my wife, Sally, who was born and raised in Nazareth, where we live today, I entered that naturalization process, and it took me 8 years and lots of threatening lawyers' letters to get citizenship, but it is at least possible. Now, we can see that what Israel is really trying to do with this citizenship law, how it's trying to seal off access to citizenship for any Palestinian who wasn't included in that small number of Palestinians who managed to stay on their land in 1948. We can see that if we look at how Israel is applying the citizenship law today, how it's allowing Palestinians, or those people who can get citizenship through marriage, what kind of restrictions it's placing on them. We can see that although somebody like me, a European or an American who marries an Israeli citizen can enter that and naturalize through that citizenship law, Palestinians have been denied that right. And that occurred in 2003. Israel passed an amendment. Basically, what started to happen in the 1990s as the Oslo process kicked in and Israel started to try and separate the occupied territories off from Israel. Today, of course, we see that manifested in a physical obstacle, the wall that Israel has built around the West Bank, making it almost impossible for Palestinians to move from the occupied territories into Israel. for couples that are married, Palestinians in places like Israel who are married to Palestinians in the occupied territories. For instance, Jenin, which is only a half-hour drive from Nazareth, two big Palestinian cities, but on different sides of the wall, one in the West Bank, one inside Israel. Before the wall was built, before the Oslo process of separation kicked in, it was very common for Palestinians in Nazareth to spend time in Jenin and vice versa, and marriages occurred. Many families have relatives in the West Bank from places like Nazareth, and so marriages occurred. And after those marriages, Israel should, under this naturalization law, which I naturalized under through the citizenship law, it should have been possible for those Palestinians to get citizenship, but in practice, Israel never gave them citizenship. And it didn't really matter to most Palestinians. They didn't, in the occupied territories, their dream was not to become an Israeli citizen. Their dream was to become a citizen of Palestine. And so both sides allowed this to drift. It only became an issue after the Oslo process kicked in. At the point of Oslo, of course, Israel implements this policy of separation. It starts to erect checkpoints. Today, of course, it's manifested in the wall that we see all around the West Bank, that carves into the West Bank. And so for Palestinians in somewhere like Jenin, if you were married to somebody, to a Palestinian in Nazareth, suddenly you can't move between your two cities, you can't move between your two families, your two lives. You really start to be trapped. And so we started to see in the 1990s, Palestinians in the occupied territories applying for citizenship because they were married to a Palestinian in Israel for the very first time, and in large numbers. And this was something that they were entitled to do under the citizenship law, as I did, and it should have taken them 5 years. Now, because Oslo begins in 1994, we start to see Palestinians applying from that kind of period in larger numbers to get citizenship through the citizenship law. Israel ignores the law, doesn't give them citizenship, and so they take a class action suit to the Israeli Supreme Court in 1999, and they win their case. Perhaps not surprisingly, the Supreme Court doesn't really have a lot of choice. It's there in the law, citizenship law in black and white, that you have the right to naturalize. And it gives the government, the Supreme Court being the Israeli Supreme Court, it tries to buy the Israeli government some time. And it says that you must implement this law from today, 1999, effectively giving the Israeli government another 5 years to comply. So that means we'll start to see the first Palestinians in the occupied territories getting citizenship through naturalization in 2004. Now, Israel, of course, doesn't want to allow Palestinians to get citizenship, the Palestinians in occupied territories. It doesn't want to expand the possibility for Palestinians to gain citizenship inside Israel. And so in 2003, it changes the citizenship law, or adds an amendment called the Citizenship and Entry into Israel Law, which effectively denies the right to Palestinians in the occupied territories who marry an Israeli citizen, a Palestinian inside Israel, to gain citizenship. And that pretty much is held to this day. Israel argued at the time that it was necessary to prevent suicide attacks. This was at the beginning of the Second Intifada, when there were some suicide attacks, and it used this security argument. The problem was that there was no evidence that people who were marrying Palestinians in the occupied territories who were marrying Palestinians inside Israel were doing so to commit terror attacks. There was no evidence of that whatsoever. And so when it was challenged in the Israeli Supreme Court, the Israeli government fell back on a second argument, a much more realistic argument for what it was really trying to achieve. It said that if Palestinians in the occupied territories were allowed to gain citizenship through marriage, this would unleash what they called a demographic demon. That isn't just a term I made up, that's an official term they used for the threat they believed would be posed by Palestinians gaining citizenship through marriage. It would unleash a demographic demon. It would allow the Palestinian population to grow. And the Israeli Supreme Court backed that argument. And so to this day, Palestinians are denied a fundamental right to fall in love and marry the person of their choice on the basis of demographic concerns. The fact that it is important for Israel to keep a solid Jewish majority. At the moment, Palestinians inside Israel are about 20% of the population. Israel does not want that percentage to grow, and therefore it's doing everything it can to prevent that from happening. And we can see that it's prepared to use citizenship as one tool for denying Palestinians the right to fulfill their rights to marry and fall in love and marry the person of their choice. Now, Israel has separated out citizenship rights between the law of return, which applies to Jews, and the citizenship law, which applies to Palestinians. That's part of the story of what Israel is doing here, but actually it goes much deeper than that. To understand what's really happening, we need to understand another distinction Israel is making, not only between two citizenship laws, but also between two kinds of nationality. Israel doesn't just divide citizenship, it divides nationality from citizenship. These are considered two different concepts in Israeli law, which was a surprise to me when I first came here. I'm a British citizen, I'm a British national. I assumed that they were synonyms. They were exactly the same thing, different words for the same idea. But in Israel, they're treated entirely differently. Israel has recognized 130 nationalities. However, it has refused to recognize one nationality. It doesn't recognize its own nationality of Israeli. The primary nationalities in Israel are Jewish and Arab. It's a bit more complicated than that, but from our point of view, I said there are 130. It needs to deal with all the anomalies. I'm one of those anomalies. When I got my Israeli citizenship, I also got a separate nationality. So I'm an Israeli citizen, but I'm also a British national. You need all these 130 different nationalities to deal with all the anomalies. But for most people in Israel, they either fall into the category of Israeli Jew or Israeli Arab, Arab nationality or Jewish nationality. Now, why is Israel separating out citizenship from nationality? And this is really the key to understanding how Israel's system of degraded citizenship for Palestinians works. What Israel is doing here is creating two different classes, or maybe better put, layers of rights. And it's doing it not based on citizenship, but based on nationality. So the best way to try and understand it is to think of the fact that you get rights based on your nationality in Israel. So Israel creates one layer of rights called citizenship rights, which in theory, and I stress here only in theory, apply to all Israeli citizens, whether you're a Jew or a Palestinian. You get certain kinds of rights because you're an Israeli citizen, and everybody in theory gets them equally. In practice, they don't get them equally. Palestinians are denied many of these rights, but at least in the statute books, on the law books, it looks like everybody's getting the same. But then Israel subverts this system of seemingly equal rights by creating another layer of rights, a superior layer of rights based on nationality. So these national rights apply primarily to Jewish citizens of the state. They get superior rights. So if there's a conflict between a citizenship right, which applies to both Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Israelis, and the national rights of Jewish Israelis, those national rights take precedence. Now, this sounds fairly confusing. I understand that. It's not something we're used to in Europe or America, and I want to explain it. Just to give you a sense of how endemic this problem is, though, let me refer you to a legal group in Haifa, close by where I am in Nazareth, called Adala. They've created a database of laws that explicitly discriminate in Israel. When I arrived 20 years ago, there were 35 such laws, which is a lot of laws. Today, there are 70 laws, so it's doubled. Now, that doesn't mean there's twice as much discrimination, a bit like this nation state law that we're going to get to in a little while. It's not that the discrimination is increasing necessarily. It was always there. It's just that Israel is being forced to legislate this discrimination under challenge in the courts from groups like Adala. The more effective Adala has been at challenging the administrative discrimination, the practical discrimination that goes on in Israel between the rights of Jews and the rights of Palestinians, the more effective it's been in the court in arguing its case, the more it's forced the Israeli governments to legislate the discrimination, because the Israeli Supreme Court is much more reluctant to overturn a law than it is an administrative practice. So what's been going on is Adala has fought a series of legal battles very successfully, and in response, Israeli governments have legislated the discrimination, have put it onto the statute books. So it looks like there's more discrimination, but actually the discrimination, and in some ways there has been some additional discrimination, but in general, the discrimination was there from the beginning. It's just needed to be legislated. It's more out in the open because of these legal challenges. Now let's take some examples of the difference between a citizenship right and a national right. In what ways are Palestinian citizens of Israel being deprived of these national rights that apply to Jews but don't apply to them as Israeli citizens? Let's take the most important right that any state has to offer, and that is the right of citizenship. That's the basis of all other rights we enjoy, is based on our citizenship. If we don't have citizenship, then if we're stateless, we're deprived of citizenship, then of course we have very few other kinds of rights. We can just be put on a plane and shipped out by any state. And of course, this is the problem that faces most Palestinians in the occupied territories. They don't have citizenship, but they are ruled by Israel, and therefore they have very, very few rights. And Israel do pretty much what it wants. So citizenship is an incredibly important right. And if you don't have it, you know that you don't have it. But how is Israel dealing with the issue of citizenship for Palestinians inside Israel? And how does that is distinct from the Jewish population inside Israel? We can see the difference here if we look at those two citizenship laws again. What are they doing? The law of return, which applies to Jews, is giving a national right for any Jew in the world to get on a plane and come to Israel and instantly claim citizenship. That's a national right. It means any Jew can do that. You don't even need a connection to the place. You don't need family members here. You don't need any history of being here. You can just simply get on a plane, paid for by Israeli taxpayers, and come here. And the state will throw money at you as well. It'll help you in all sorts of ways, giving you tax discounts, loans, grants, all sorts of things, preferential treatment to encourage you to come here. That's a national right. That does not apply to Palestinian citizens of Israel. They do not have those kinds of national rights in terms of citizenship. Palestinian inside Israel, like my wife, gets her citizenship through the citizenship law, which simply gives her a citizenship right to citizenship, if you like. So what she gets is the right to be here. She can pass that right down to her family, but she cannot extend it to any other family members. She has relatives who were exiled, who were forced out of the country in 1948 during the Nakba, and now live in Amman in Jordan, but they cannot come here. She cannot bring them here. She has no right to bring them here. And that's because she simply has this individual citizenship right through the citizenship law. She can't expand it out to anybody else. It's not a national right. She can't claim relatives, the right for relatives. So there's an important distinction between the individual rights of Palestinians who have citizenship and the national rights of Jews who have citizenship. But still, citizenship is still a fairly abstract concept. Let's try and take more practical issues where we can see how this distinction between citizenship rights and national rights applies. If we take the two most important material rights that we enjoy anywhere in the world, any citizen, the two most important material rights we enjoy are land and water, access to land and water, the essentials of life. We won't live long without land or water. How does Israel deal with these? Here we can see these key material resources the state has, how Israel is using them. Now, water illustrates this point quite neatly because it's both a citizenship right and a national right. So it means that any Israeli citizen, whether they're a Jew or a Palestinian, should have access, in theory, to an equal right to water wherever they live. So it means in Nazareth, when I turn on my tap, I get the same quality of water at the same price as they do in the city next door to me, which used to be called Nazareth, and they renamed a little while ago North Galil, because it's a citizenship right. Does that mean that all citizens of Israel have an equal right to water? No, I said it only applies in theory. So many Palestinians inside Israel who live in unrecognized villages, Israel unrecognized many Bedouin communities, particularly down in the south of Israel, a long time ago, decades ago. And they're living effectively as they've been criminalized by their own state. And there are dozens of these communities. Palestinians living in those kinds of communities have no access to water where they live. They are denied the right to water because they're seen as criminals inside their communities. Israel has criminalized their communities. And the argument is that they shouldn't be rewarded with access to water because they are criminals. Even though, of course, they're living on land which they have the title deeds to, which their great-grandfathers were living on. It doesn't matter. From Israel's point of view, they're criminals, they're trespassers, they're squatters on state land, and therefore they shouldn't be rewarded by having access to water. Now, of course, this is being challenged in the Supreme Court, all of these kinds of things that ultimately get challenged in the Supreme Court. And the government has argued that these are criminals, they mustn't have a right to water, whereas human rights lawyers have argued, well, they are citizens and therefore they have a right to water as citizens. They have an individual citizenship right to water. And the Supreme Court, with the wisdom of Solomon, has come up with this compromise. It says, yes, as citizens, they do have a right to water, but as criminals living on state land, they don't have a right to water. So what must happen is that the state must provide them with water from a standpipe several miles from their village, and they can go and travel there every day and collect water in a jerry can, bring it back to their homes. So I wanted to make this point clear so that we see that actually, although in theory, Palestinian citizens of Israel do have these individual citizenship rights, in practice doesn't mean therefore they have equal rights with Israeli Jews. In many cases, these equal rights are not actually implemented in practice. But In theory, they're there. But we should also see that water is not only a citizenship right, it's also a national right. More importantly, it's a national right. And it's treated as a national right when it comes to its commercial application. So in industry, in agriculture, when you're making money from the use of water, it's considered a national right. And that means it only applies to Jews. Now, this is done in a fairly sneaky, covert kind of way. Israel does this by restricting access to certain kinds of communities. Much of the land in Israel is occupied by specific kinds of communities. They're called cooperative communities, where only Jews can live. Now, Israel doesn't want to say only Jews can live in these communities because that might sound a little bit like apartheid South Africa. So what it says instead is that each of these communities must have an admissions committee which can set its own rules about who can live there. One thing that is always the case is that these admissions committees, and they apply to hundreds of communities that control most of the land in Israel, these admission committees are only accessible to Jewish citizens of the state. Palestinian citizens of Israel are always denied the right to live in these communities. Now, this is a useful way of then controlling water, because what happens is Israel allows agriculture, commercial agriculture, and often industry as well, to be done in these restrictive cooperative communities. That's where it's done. So if you want to do agriculture on a commercial basis, you need to live in one of these communities. They're quite famous, like the kibbutz and the moshav. You have to live in one of these communities, but to live in one of these communities, you have to get permission from an admissions committee. And the admissions committee won't let you in unless you're Jewish. So in this way, you can restrict access to water, to the commercial use of water, only in these kinds of communities. And that means Palestinians are effectively excluded from a key resource of the state, water, and its commercial exploitation. So they're not able to take part in industrial processes. They're not capable of getting involved in intensive agriculture. And in fact, most of the Palestinian land, of course, has been taken by Israel over the decades, and most Palestinians are now forced to work in casual labor, many of them commuting long distances to cities, often working in farming, but as hired hands, or in construction work. So this is one way that Israel has dealt with the issue of keeping a key resource of the state, water, strictly for the Jewish population, not the Palestinian population. If we turn to land, we can see that the issue there is even clearer. Israel has nationalized 93% of its land. That's a very large amount of the land. But the important point to get across here is that when it says it's nationalized the land, well, the question one has to ask is, who is it nationalized for? Who is the land nationalized for? Well, it's not nationalized for Israelis because there is no Israeli nationality. Israel, as I mentioned earlier, has not allowed an Israeli nationality. It's created these separate nationalities, a Jewish and Arab nationality. So this way, when Israel nationalizes 93% of the land, it's not nationalized for Israelis because there's no Israeli nationality. It's not even nationalized for Israeli Jews. There's no Israeli Jewish nationality. That's been tested in the courts as well. Some left-wing Israeli Jews wanted to be classified as Israeli Jewish nationals, and the Israeli courts rejected that idea. They said there's only one Jewish people around the world. All Jews belong to one nationality. You can't subdivide the Jewish people into Israeli Jews and non-Israeli Jews. All Jews, wherever they live, are part of the Jewish nation. So when Israel nationalizes 93% of the land, it's actually nationalizing it for all Jews around the world. So actually the land in Israel, that 93% of the land, is nationalized for all Jews around the world, wherever they live, whatever connection they have with Israel. It belongs to them collectively. That's why Israeli Jews don't buy the freehold on land. If you buy a house, you're a Jew in Israel, and you buy a freehold, buy a house, piece of land, you're not getting the freehold on it. You're getting a lease from the government, a long-term lease to use the land. But in effect, you're guarding it on behalf of the Jewish people. You're there as a representative of all Jews in the world using the land on their behalf. Palestinians, on the other hand, Palestinian citizens of Israel, are restricted to about 2% of the land, which is their built-up area. They've got about 120 communities that were left that weren't ethnically cleansed in 1948, and they're on about 2% of the land, and that's the restricted area on which Palestinians are allowed to live. They can't gain access to these other kinds of communities that have the admissions committees, and it's very difficult for them to move to other kinds of areas. So they're really trapped in these ghettos on about 2% of the land, whereas Israeli Jews have access to the full 93% of the land, which is there for their use. Now, this system really kind of creates a complete circle, because what we have here is a law of return which entitles any Jew in the world to come here and instantly claim citizenship as a national right. And then we have almost all of the land in Israel reserved exclusively for Jewish people from around the world. The idea is here that really Israeli citizenship is a meaningless concept. We tend to talk about Israeli citizenship as though it's meaningful, but actually the point I'm trying to make here is it's not really meaningful. It's a cover story. What's really meaningful in Israel is Jewish nationality. And it's not just the Jews who live in Israel who count, it's all Jews around the world. They're really the owners of the land. Even Ariel Sharon, the famous general who became a prime minister of Israel, tried to express this in a Knesset speech when he said that the Jews, meaning all Jews around the world, were the landlords of this land, and the Palestinians were merely tenants. And like tenants, if they get a bit uppity, get a bit difficult, they don't do what they're told, they can be kicked out of the property. That was Ariel Sharon's description, but it's a fairly good illustration of actually what the situation is. This is effectively what the nation state law is trying to achieve. It's trying to make much more explicit what Ariel Sharon was talking about, and he was talking about that back in the 90s. And it's applied ever since. I mean, it applied before Ariel Sharon said it. It applied right from the beginning, from the creation of the state. The state was creating these admissions committees that were there to create kibbutz and moshav exclusively for Jews, to create almost all of the land. It was confiscating the land from Palestinian citizens from communities like Nazareth. Nazareth once had lots of land. Most of the Jezreel Valley, we look down from my house right now, I can see the Jezreel Valley because I'm up on the hill in Nazareth. But that land was farmed by Palestinian farmers from communities like Nazareth. Today, they've had all of that land taken away. It's Jewish kibbutz farming that land. Now, there are cities that have been built on that land, like Afula, Migdal HaEmek, and so on, all around us. The land up on the other side of the ridge where I live is now a Jewish city called Nof HaGalil. So communities like Nazareth have been starved of all their land. They've been trapped inside these ghettos, really without any ability to expand, deprived of industrial areas, deprived of the ability to do agriculture, made an entirely dependent labor force, dependent on the goodwill of the state, which is one of the big employers, the Histadrut, which is a trade union federation, which is controlled by the Israeli political parties. So for Palestinians here, they feel like they are being treated like tenants. That's their status. Israel makes it very clear that that's their status. What the nation state law was trying to do is make that explicit, that relationship. It didn't really change anything. What's interesting, if you look back at the debates about the nation state law when it was being drafted and going through the Knesset, was that the right wing, Netanyahu's party and so on, the right wingers were very enthusiastic about this law, but the left wing, what's called the left wing in Israel, the Zionist left wing, the Labour Party, I wouldn't call them left wing, but that's how they style themselves. The Labour Party was saying this law is unnecessary, it's redundant. If you look at the language that the left is using, it's very interesting. They're not saying it's wrong, it's immoral. They're saying it's redundant, it's unnecessary. In other words, we're already doing all of this. Why do we need a law that makes it explicit that we're doing it? Because this is going to make us look very bad abroad. It will open people's eyes up to what's going on. The people who created the state, the Labour Party, the socialists, the good guys, allegedly, they tried to conceal all of this stuff that I'm talking about now. The admissions committees, the creation of two citizenship laws, the distinction between citizenship and nationality. They rigged the whole system to make sure that Jews had very much superior rights to Palestinians, despite citizenship. They worked very hard to conceal that so nobody would be able to see it, understand outside. It would be too complicated, it would be too veiled for anybody to understand what was going on. What the nation state law does is push this into your face, say, look, this is what's going on. Jews have more rights than Palestinians, and there it is in the law. There's no equality. I should point out there's never been equality in any Israeli law. Equality is not part of Israel's basic laws. It has a sort of series of a dozen or so basic laws, which are the equivalent of a constitution in Israel. None of those laws specify equality. That's very important. The one effort to create a law, a basic law that would specify equality, which was put forward by the Palestinian parties in the Knesset, the people who represent communities like Nazareth, when they tried to put through a law specifying that everybody would have equal citizenship, they couldn't even get it accepted by the drafting committee. Usually these laws are put to the Knesset, and the Knesset would, you could be sure, would reject it. But in this case, they weren't even allowed to put it to the Knesset. It was stopped before that stage. So there's no possibility in Israel of Jewish legislators considering equality. It's just not on the table at all. It's very clear in Israeli law, in Israeli administrative practice, in Israeli ideology, that there is no equality, and there must not be. It's at the very heart of what Zionism means in Israel. Zionism means there's privileges for Jews. The difference is with the nation state law is that Israel has made that explicit. It's telling everybody, the world, declaring in English, you can look it up, you can put it up on a website, you can Google search it. It's there in black and white telling you what's going on. Whereas before that law, before 2018, it involved a lot of trouble trying to explain how all of this system worked. So this is, I think, the big difference. And it's a difference really of image management. It's a difference, and we can see this actually going on right now in Jerusalem. What we're seeing is the gradual emergence of a sort of fascistic Zionism, which is drawing on the same principles as labor Zionism, the Zionism of Ben-Gurion and the founders of the Israeli state, but is no longer trying to conceal it, is no longer trying to be nice. The guys out there, the Lahava, the Kahanists who are out on the street beating up Palestinians right now, they are doing that as part of a new kind of aggressive Zionism that says, we don't worry about our image. We don't care what foreigners, we don't care what Americans or Europeans think about what's going on here anymore. We're not going to veil it. We're not going to conceal it. We're going to just get on with it. We're in a hurry. We're not going to hang around and draw this out over decades more as our fathers and grandfathers wanted to do. We want to do it now, today. What's holding us back? And really the nation state law is part of that whole process of making much more explicit what's going on here. One can argue that in some ways, maybe that's a good thing. It's clearer to everybody what's going on. But of course, there's a lot of pain involved in this, because as this aggression intensifies, there's a price to be paid. As this process speeds up and intensifies, Palestinians pay a heavy price. I could go on talking for a lot longer, of course, but I see the time is moving on, and I don't know whether there was going to be a chance for people to ask questions. But so maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was super, super insightful. And we have a few questions here in the chat from folks who are thinking about your words and wrestling with these things. I guess a question that is here in the chat is, what about asylum seekers? Can they achieve refugee status and then citizenship? Are they able to?
Okay, so Israel isn't just concerned about Palestinians. This isn't really about Palestinians. So the problem with Palestinians is that Palestinians are the native people. They are the ones in the largest numbers in this region that is being Judaized by Israel. And they pose the biggest threat. Why? Because international law is on their side in many cases. So they have rights, and Israel is trying to erode the status of international law. It's trying to erode their rights, and it's trying to drive them off their land. And that has to be done fairly aggressively because Palestinian population is growing and so on. But Israel is an equal opportunities. Its policy is equal opportunities in its racism. It's against all non-Jews having rights here, eroding the Jewish dominance and Jewish majority. And therefore, Israel has taken against all non-Jews being here. There have been two kinds of, in the last 20 years or so, two different kinds of non-Jews who have arrived. Foreign workers. Israel, basically, once Israel, as part of the Oslo process, as it sealed off the occupied territories and made it almost impossible for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to get into Israel. Before the Oslo process, they've been doing most of the dirty work. They've been doing the buildings, dying on the building sites. So Israel has terrible health and safety procedures. Palestinians are always falling off to their death on building sites because they're the ones doing the work. They were building the high rises in Tel Aviv and so on. They were cleaning the dishes in the restaurants. All of that stuff was going on. But after the Oslo process, it gets very difficult for them to get into Israel. So Israel has to bring in a new population who are prepared to do this kind of dirty work. And so it starts to bring in foreign workers, brings in Nigerians, Chinese, Filipinos, Thais to do agriculture, construction work, healthcare, looking after people in care homes and so on. But what happens is it starts to realize that unlike the Palestinians in the occupied territories who go home every day, I mean, they're living a short distance away, so they just go back home in the evenings. The people who are coming from China and Nigeria and so on are having to live in Israel. So they're getting long-term visas to work, working visas. And what starts to happen is that they start to fall in love and marry Israeli Jews. They're living in Jewish cities like Tel Aviv. And you start to see couples forming and then having kids and so on. And then Israel starts to panic because it's starting to get this hybrid population of non-Jews who are coming in via the foreign workers. And so it starts to, for the very first time in its history, it creates an immigration police. Israel doesn't have an immigration policy. It has Jews are allowed to come, but that's not seen as immigration. That's seen as aliyah. That's ascending to the land to the Holy Land, to the land that the Promised Land. So it creates this immigration police to start kicking these foreign workers out. It's made life quite difficult for them. And the same with asylum seekers. What was happening is that people were fleeing from war zones in Africa, and they were coming in through the Sinai Desert and getting into Israel, which was a relatively peaceful place within the region. I mean, I say relatively. And Israel started to get back, this was back in the mid-2000s, it started to get a population of about 60,000 asylum seekers. Now, under the conventions Israel has ratified, it has to allow those asylum seekers into the country. Now, Israel didn't want to do that. So what it quickly did is it built another of its famous fences, walls across the Sinai Desert, which is a long, big stretch of desert. But it did it very fast to stop and then station soldiers all along it to stop those asylum seekers coming in. So it basically stopped the influx of asylum seekers, but it was trapped with the 60,000 that were already there. So what it's been doing ever since is trying to get rid of them and doing it in a way that doesn't attract the ire of the international community. First of all, it created a prison for them in the Negev Desert, a really horrible one, desert camp, terrible temperatures in the Negev Desert, again, to make it so unbearable for these asylum seekers, they decided to go somewhere else. And then it was emerged that it'd been doing secret deals with regimes in Africa, Rwanda, and so on, third-party African states to then persuade to fly these asylum seekers to a third country. So it wasn't taking them back to the place where they were being persecuted. But then those countries where then it was discovered shipping them back to their country where they were being persecuted. So it was just a way of trying to veil what it was doing. So it's had a very ugly, hostile attitude to asylum seekers. I mean, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm trying to talk very quickly, so I'm cutting corners here. But just so you get a sense, it really has had a very ugly attitude towards all non-Jews. Because it sees it. The key issue here is it's trying to make this. What it really wants is a Jewish fortress with only Jews living here, and it's trying to do that in a way that doesn't embarrass its sponsors, primarily in America and Europe. So it's having to do it in a way that looks legal, looks kind of rational, and looks like it's about security. But the issue to understand here is when you or I talk about security, we usually mean threats to our physical safety, to our livelihoods, and if we were talking in the Israeli context, we would think when Israelis talk about security that what they mean is suicide bombers and people with guns. But actually, usually when Israel is talking about its security, it doesn't mean that at all. I'm not saying it never means that, but it doesn't usually mean that. When it talks about security, it's actually talking about demographic security. This is what is really the key issue for Israel. You actually see this in the Human Rights Watch report. They spend quite a bit of time explaining about the importance of demography. I was glad to see that the focus they put on that. How important it is to Israel, demographic security. What it means is keeping a Jewish majority at any cost. It doesn't matter what rights are violated, who dies, who gets expelled or ethnically cleansed, as long as Israel keeps its demographic security. This is its priority, and it leads to lots of ugly policies.
Yeah, that's that's very helpful to hear, Jonathan. Another question that is like in similar vein, thinking about international law. You talk about international law a bit. So with Mountain Calls describing Israel as an apartheid state, so we see the report today, and other organizations slowly but surely coming to this conclusion. What do you think international law? Do you think international law, is gaining enough momentum to challenge the policies, to shift the framework, to do something, or is still a toothless dog?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's very difficult to judge. I think it's significant that the ICC I thought the ICC would just fizzle out, and it would decide it wasn't going to dare take on Europe and America, particularly America. looking like it might go after Israel. It's already a very bold move to say that that its jurisdiction applies to the occupied territories, and therefore exposing potentially Israeli officials to war crimes tribunals. Doesn't mean that it's going to happen yet, but it does open the door to that. And that's quite a bold move by the ICC. They've dragged their feet for a very long time, which tells you, I mean, they didn't need to do that. Anybody could have told them that their jurisdiction applies, almost immediately, but they spent years deciding this, which is a sign of the pressures on them. But they did, and we saw Trump intensifying that pressure on them by, threatening to arrest them, take their seize their bank accounts and all that kind of stuff. Lots of threats going on towards them. And despite all of that, they still came, and you might argue, well, maybe because of Biden, they decided they could afford it. But whatever, they did take that step. And it's interesting to see that, what we're seeing is Western states increasingly, I think, are trying to subvert international law, to downgrade international law. We're seeing international law being downgraded on all fronts. And Israel has really paved the way in doing that. Israel showed through its attacks, its repeated attacks on Gaza, that it could do that and still claim or could erode the will of the international community to uphold international law. That's what it really did. It wore down the international community's commitment to international law by repeatedly attacking Gaza and saying it's within our rights to do this. What are you going to do about it? And the Goldstone report tried to stand up to Israel on this and say these are violations of these are war crimes and so on. And then Goldstone was ritually humiliated by his own Jewish community and sort of partially backed down. And so every time somebody's trying to stick their head up and say, so I'm going to do something here in upholding international law, Israel has sort of beaten them up over it. And so it's a wearing down process. And the problem here is, of course, that America and Europe don't particularly have an interest in allowing Israel to be held to that mark on international law. Because if you start to say what Israel is doing in Gaza violates international law, well, then what did the US do in Fallujah? What did Britain do in Basra, and so on? So you open a door to a situation none of these Western states really want. So Israel becomes a kind of canary in the coal mine for them, and they want to keep it alive. So I think it will be extremely tough for the ICC to follow through with these investigations in any serious way. But at the same time, I think Israel is pushing its luck so far. It's trying to speed things up. The whole talk about annexation and so on is really spitting in the international community's, particularly Europeans' face, and saying, what are you going to do about it? And the question is, how much humiliation, particularly, can the Europeans take on this issue? I fear they can take a great deal, but who knows?
Totally. So no easy answers, but very good information. And I know you're running out of time, Jonathan, and there are such great questions here. It looks like we'll need to bring Jonathan on again sometime because there are such great questions. Unfortunately, we're unable to get through all the questions because we don't have too much time. But Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing, for your insights, for your depth of knowledge. I believe we've all been enriched. We've all learned something. We've all been challenged to think differently. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'm encouraged to see people taking such an interest in what's going on. Remember that I think it's my finishing point, I suppose, would be we should take some encouragement on this international. We have to distinguish between those people who are upholding international law on the ground, who are observing and if you like, are our consciences, like B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch, who are finding the courage now to speak out. I mean, I wish they'd done it a long time ago, but at least they are doing it now. And our institutions, which are much more reluctant to do things. But I do think there's a battle here raging between the Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem camp, who are concerned, and we need to fortify them. We need to encourage them to speak up. And if they are fortified and they can leverage pressure on groups like the ICC, then we can start to see things happening. If we sit back and we don't do anything, then all of this work they're doing will fizzle into nothing, and the ICC will lose its nerve, and Israel will carry on and intensify what it is doing. So it's important that we hold our nerve, that we show our commitment to human rights here, and we back up the kinds of reports, we amplify the message that's being sent out by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you once again. And now to move to the next part of our program, we're working on changing. Bye. All right, then. Take care, okay. Jonathan.
All the best.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe. So that was wonderful. Thank you all for your wonderful questions, and we will definitely find a way of getting to them, because I think this conversation is important. So we're working on changing our approach to advocacy in these sessions. We found out, though, that although people are super excited and want to take some action, oftentimes it gets difficult after the sessions to take action, just because, you know, life gets in the way. So starting from today, we'd like to give all of us an opportunity to get started on advocacy for the week. So we have a renewed approach, and Omar will talk to us more about that. Omar, would you want to take that?
Thank you, Elom. We're going to be starting from the next period to really, instead of just saying it is everybody does the action on their own, to come together during the meeting and try to attempt to do the actions together as a group. I think this would encourage people. If we're working all together, if we're sending an email, we'll all send an email together. Of course, you don't have to, but if for the people who want to be involved with advocacy, so we could really feel the momentum growing. So it's basically doing it step by step together as a community. Every week, the principle of Kumi was to not only just be an education platform, but in addition to be also a tool of advocacy and to take solid steps on the ground. And we feel that sometimes we are not as faithful to the principles of Kumi as much as we'd like to, and we understand that it might be challenging for some people and easier for others, but as a community and a group, it would be really more helpful for us to work together. So basically sending an email together. Before we share, we will be sharing the action of today in the media, but before on the page. I want just to give you an update, as the tradition goes, of the news in Palestine, what's happening on the ground. Again, if you're not reading the Sabil weekly wave of prayer, we encourage you to use it. It's an excellent tool of information. So for people who have been following the news in Palestine and Israel, Jerusalem has, East Jerusalem, especially Damascus Gate, has been a place of high tension, especially Jerusalem, Old City. We're in the middle of the month of Ramadan, and after people do iftar, they break their fast. People go for special worship, prayer services at mosques, especially at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The army has installed barriers for the community to make it more difficult to have access to the Old City. And since the past 5 days or week, there has been continuous demonstrations in East Jerusalem, which has also caused many of the right-wing groups inside Israel to try, and there has been continuous clashes. Jerusalem has been really a war zone in the past week. The streets of Jerusalem filled with tear gas, rubber bullets, police beating up people, and confrontations between the Palestinian protesters and Israeli right-wing settlers and activists and the Israeli police. Yesterday, Israel backed off and removed the barrier. So this is another major success story for Palestinians. When we demonstrate, demand our rights, things get accomplished. And in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Israel, for many of the Palestinians who have unified the holidays, and especially for the churches who follow the Eastern calendar, It was Sunday was Palm Sunday, and we are having our Holy Week this week. So please, for everybody who have remember the people of Jerusalem, the church, and the community as we celebrate Easter this week. Jonathan has mentioned it's big news. Major organizations are calling Israel an apartheid state, basing it on the facts and the statistics on the ground. So we were very much excited with Beit Salem using this terminology, and now Human Rights Watch, and we hope others will follow. It is very difficult to hide the unjust policies that Israel uses in the occupied territories or inside Israel. There's a beautiful love story that happened in Palestine. Asim, who's over here, has served 18 years in prison. He was just released. During his time in prison, he met Sumud. Sumud was a researcher working at a Damir organization working on research on Palestinian prisoners. They fell in love, and in the past 3 years, there was a beautiful love story, and he was released, and on the first day they got engaged. So this is something that is really nice. Hopefully, eventually, it could be done in a book or a novel or as a movie. But it's a beautiful story. We're very happy for both of them. Sumud is the daughter of Ahmed Saadat, one of the Palestinian leader, who is also in Israel, in an Israeli prison. There's so much confusion regarding Palestinian elections. People, there's high rumors that they're going to get postponed. We will know for sure on Thursday. There's pressure to hold them, and others are saying let's cancel them. The biggest debate is Israel is refusing for Palestinians in East Jerusalem to participate in the elections or to vote. So that's a huge challenge, and it's a major decision, because if the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem and Gaza, participate in the elections, as if we have surrendered that East Jerusalem is no longer part of the occupied territories or the future state of Palestine. And others are debating whether it's important for the democratic process and for the unification of our people to go through the election, even if it is it's with the cost of East Jerusalem not participating. So the debate is intense. We're hoping there is very little pressure on Israel to allow the elections in East Jerusalem. According to the accords and the treaties and the Oslo agreement that Israel has signed, they are refusing to apply or to respect the treaties that have been signed. So this was a very brief update from the ground. I hope it was very helpful. Ryan, could you share the advocacy action? Sorry, we're having some problems. Our main person who helps us, Mark, is not being allowed to go back into Kumi because of, I don't know what happened with all of the confusion at the beginning of the meeting. So, okay. So we agree that sucks big time and we don't like it. It is not within the value system of our value system or within the ethics of how we see or envision human rights, and we advocate for equality for all citizens inside Israel. So what we're asking is if we can dedicate a few minutes now, either doing option 1 or option 2 and option 2. And Ryan, I think your mouse, okay. So the first option is share information on alternatives to the nation state law. It is not too late to enshrine the equality of all Israeli citizens within its basic laws. And yet members of Knesset, mainly the Arab members of Knesset, have been barred from even considering the possibility, the proposed basic law, the state of all its citizens, Arab members of the Knesset have been asking for Israel to accept a basic law that it is a state of all its citizens, and this continues to be rejected by Israel. But the Knesset rulemakers have decided such a bill would challenge the belief that Israel is a state for all Jewish people. You can read more about the proposed bill here. Then, using the link, it will be also posted in the chat. Then post this question on a social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or even send it to your mailing list. Why does Israel continue to reject passing the law called Basic Law, State of All Its Citizens, which calls for Israel to treat all its citizens equally? It's common sense, it's basic. For anybody who advocates for human rights, all citizens of every country in the world should have equal rights. So it's the members of some members of the Knesset, mainly from the Arab Joint List, have been proposing this law, but it keeps being denied inside the Knesset. So it's a basic thing. It's what we're hoping through this action that we open the discussion for anybody who would claim that Israel is a perfect democratic state to argue using this law. Option two, there are many people inside Israel, a huge percentage of the Knesset even refused to approve the Knesset law. It did not pass unanimously. So there are these organizations that are doing work. They're not the only organizations, but there are some of the good organizations out there who oppose the nation state law. So we encourage you to write them an email, just a very nice email, just saying that you are not alone. Some of those people who are working on the advocacy level feel sometimes isolated or alone, and most of the emails that they receive are hate mail. It would be nice for people around the world, including also Palestine and Israel, just to write. You could write an email now to mail@beitsalem.org. Just say thank you for your work. You do amazing reports. You make always a stand for human rights, and we appreciate this. The same thing would be for ACRI, Gisha, Gashalom, the new Israel Fund, Molad, Ta'ayush. They do an amazing work, and Rabbis for Human Rights. Although not perfectly we align as Sabil with all of the work that these organizations do, but we recognize that they do, many of them do amazing work, and we need to send them solidarity mail. So the point of it is that it's either you pick 1, 2, 3, as many as you like, organizations maybe that you are familiar with, and just write them. We will write them all now an email just saying thank you for your work. It would be nice to have the emails by themselves. And we have also another list. Thank you, Ryan. So there is another list of journalists like Amira Hass, Gidon Levy, and those people are on either on social media or their emails. We have placed it here. It would be really nice just to send them an email. It would be good, Ryan, just to help people not to misspell the emails, just to have them, if it's possible, on the chat. Maybe you have already done this. Okay, thank you, Ryan. So what we are encouraging everybody who is Ilan Pape, Peter Benart, Hagai Lad, who is also from Beit Salem, director. And this is what we're going. We're dedicating now few minutes, 5 minutes, hopefully, that we all write people email, just say thank you for your work. It would be also nice to mention why you're doing this and maybe introducing yourself, where you're from, and how you are familiar with their work. So we'll use this time to do some advocacy work. I managed to send all of the emails, everybody. So I don't know about others. So it's a good way to spam people, being positive and just saying, thank you. And thank you all. Before we move into the next, I would like to announce what we're doing next week. So thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. And it will be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. We would greatly appreciate if you shared this amazing session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on our future sessions. Next week, we will look at the freedom of speech for Palestinians and their supporters. If you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before they begin, you can register or email reminders at kumi.com/online using the form at the bottom of the page. We hope to see you back here next week. Thank you again, and good morning, good evening, depending on where you are.